Any organization, any foundation, any grassroots NGO that's working with people has storytellers there. The kids that you're working with in an orphanage, the people who are using the food bank, all of these people have stories to tell. Telling stories is what makes us human.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange, a podcast from IPM Advancement. We believe strong nonprofits can change the world, and our goal with each episode is to bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders from the nonprofit sector. Let's get started. Welcome, listeners. I'm your host, Russ Fanos, and with me today is Josh Gryniewicz, Chief Narrative Strategist for Odd Duck LLC. Josh is a master of storytelling for social change, a frequent NPFX guest, and one of my favorite people to talk shop with. Welcome back, Josh.
Thanks, Russ. Appreciate it.
Josh is back today in a special capacity. Similar to our recent series of interviews focused on donor stewardship with Sammy Zoss, we are working with Josh to launch his own interview series here on NPFX focused on narrative strategy. He'll be interviewing fellow experts who are also using storytelling to make an impact in the world. These are folks using these methods to drive social change, mission impact, and fundraising. Josh, before we get to your first guest, tell us a little bit about why you wanted to start this series.
Yeah, I think to start off with, Russ, it's sort of like an always a bridesmaid, never a bride situation. You always look like you're having so much fun interviewing the guests. And I'm just like, when is it going to be my turn? No, but seriously, we live in times of extreme uncertainty, right? So I was probably back in October or September, I started having conversations with colleagues, doing what I do. How I mitigate uncertainty and the anxieties around uncertainty is just have a lot of conversations, get very curious and very deep. And so, at a certain point, I was like, oh man, I should be recording these.
Yeah.
But alas, I do not have a podcast. You do. And you have the exact audience that I would want to be hearing some of the things that I was hearing from our colleagues in this space. And so I think we did an episode on hope-centric messaging.
Yes.
It's definitely been the most popular appearance that I've had on your show. And after that, we just started talking, some of the anecdotes that I had shared on that episode, were anecdotes that I had heard in these conversations. And I was like, well, let's go right to the source.
Yeah.
So that was the idea. And the series sort of evolved out of that, and figuring out how the landscape of impact-driven storytelling is changing from the experts who are on the front lines of that.
Awesome. I love it. And that brings us to your first guest, Kurt Shaw. Kurt is one of the executive directors of a Brazilian nonprofit called, and excuse my Portuguese, Usina de Imaginação, which translates to the Imagination Mill. What was it about Kurt and the work that he does that made you want to interview him?
One of the things that Kurt's doing really effectively is doing this sort of collective storytelling with the community, where the community is driving the story. They're choosing the genre, they're choosing how the story gets expressed, in what medium, and it's totally organic.
Yeah,
and to me, that's absolutely fascinating. Odd Duck tries to achieve that in communities, oftentimes with narrative framing and with trying to kind of shape things for an audience and deliver that. But what Kurt's doing is going in and actually just sort of harnessing that raw power.
Yeah.
And that was just fascinating to hear about. It was fascinating to see some of the examples of his work. And we were like, oh, that's guest number one.
Well, cool. Let's dive in. Let's play the interview. And then Josh and I will be back to discuss how you, our listeners, can make use of some of this advice in your own organizations. Take it away, Josh and Kurt.
Welcome, Kurt. Really excited to have you and excited to have this conversation. And I think just to start off, if you could share with our listeners a little bit about yourself and the work that you do.
Sure. My name is Kurt Shaw, and I run a Brazilian organization called Usina da Imaginação, which literally means the imagination mill. And I started off all of this in a very odd way. I sort of thought that I would be an academic when I was in college and growing up. I studied philosophy, I studied classical languages, I studied Hebrew and Greek. But in the middle of that, I spent a lot of time in Latin America and learning particularly about social transformation movements, and was tremendously inspired by that. When I went back to do my PhD, I felt like I was lost. It was an awful experience. And quite frankly, Harvard was one of the most anti-intellectual places I'd ever been. I really felt as if people were in a professional school for academics as opposed to really thinking about hard questions. Whereas when you work with street kids, they care about big questions. If you're sleeping under a bridge at night and you're 16 years old, you want to know what the meaning of life is, or at least to be able to think about it. And so I began working with street kids, organized a network of about 500 different organizations working with homeless children and marginalized children all over Latin America. Spent 6 years traveling from city to city, meeting with a small group of nuns, a social movement, a group of kids who did art in the street, and trying to bring them together. It was right at the beginning of the internet. So it was an opportunity to use that excitement about the new internet as a way to communicate people. Wanted very hard to challenge the idea that comes from a lot of development work that somebody at UNICEF, at the Sorbonne, at Harvard, really knows what the best way to do these things are. And it's not. You don't. The people who really know how to work on these things are the people who are doing it on the ground. And so our challenge was, how is it that you can get a group that's working with indigenous street kids in Mexico to be able to teach their lessons to people who are doing it in Ecuador or in Bolivia or in Brazil. And film turned out to be an amazing way for that to happen, because really smart kids and teenagers who think about life and are trying to use art and conversation to think about what they're doing. Film is a great way to do it. Writing academic papers, that doesn't work, but film is great. And so film became the way that happened, along with Rita da Silva, who runs Usina da Imaginação with me. We developed a series of ways of using both documentaries and fictional films so that kids who are on the margins of society, indigenous kids, Afro-Brazilian kids, Afro-Colombian kids, child soldiers, child laborers, could use film as a way to communicate what their experience is, whether that's communicating it to their own community, whether that's communicating it to the broader world, or to kids who are like them in other countries.
Fantastic. And I'm wondering if, I know a lot of nonprofits and foundations aspire to have this more collaborative dynamic with community, with population that they serve, with the folks with lived experience. You're saying film is a great way to do that, but I'm wondering, even just to zoom out further, Kurt, like how does somebody go into a space and create the openness to actually listen and learn from the community itself on the most effective ways to do social change?
Those two words that you used are essential, Josh. You said listening and learning. And you have to go into any community understanding that they know much more than you do. The entire experience of training for specialists and professionals in the United States and Europe is to train you to think that you know. But I think that we really have to go back to the original insights of Socratic dialogues, which is the only thing I know is I don't. And I may have ways of helping people to think. I may have questions that are interesting. But it's really about going into someplace and saying, I'm a kid here. I'm really learning. There's an amazing ethnomusicologist named Stephen Feld who talks about the time that he spent in Papua New Guinea and how he made a huge change in his methodology of research when he recognized that, he was 27 years old. He was doing his PhD at Columbia University, but for them, he was a child. And he needed to learn how to be a child so that he could learn with them. You see very similar things. We're financing the research of a group of researchers in Bahia, in the northeast of Brazil, and they're working with Afro-Brazilian religious groups. And when you join a terreiro, an Afro-Brazilian religious group, you join as a baby. The age that somebody has in that group is how many years they have been in the group, now, not how old they are. It's actually based on Yoruba kinship rituals. And so they insist, look, we've been in this group for 5 or 10 years, but we are much more children than kids who are 12.
Right.
And so I think that that's a lot of it, to go into a place and understand that you're a kid there, that you're there to learn.
Yeah.
You're not there to teach, to offer solutions.
It makes me think of beginner's mind in some Eastern religions as well.
Sure.
My thought is, for institutions and organizations, there's so much structure, bureaucracy, all of that. How do you, I can see where as an individual, maybe coming in as a facilitator to sort of harvest some of those learnings, but how as an organization do we navigate that space? How can we say, oh, we have to be babies here, right?
Right. And that's a tremendous problem for any organization. One of the books that's most influenced me is one called Seeing Like the State, which is by a Yale anthropologist.
Yeah.
Love it. Fantastic book, but it's trying to understand that the state has a perspective, but the state also is very limited in the way that it knows. What is the epistemology that the state uses in order to understand? And I can talk about that more than I can about, say, the Ford Foundation or about other big organizations, because at least I've thought about it more. But the state sees in certain ways. It sees through numbers. It sees through statistics. It sees through votes. And one of the biggest challenges for democracy in today's world, I think, is that the ways that most people on the margins think and communicate are not the ways that the state sees. When you've got a group of Afro-Brazilian street kids, they don't write white papers.
Right.
When you have a group of indigenous parents who are in the Amazon and have amazing insight about the ways that you raise children, they don't create the statistics that the state is capable of seeing. And so how does that happen? And there, I think that that film is actually a really, really powerful way, because the moment that you put those kids or those indigenous parents on the screen, suddenly they're taken more seriously.
Right.
There's a question of what are the structures of dialogue that make it possible to see two sides of a dialogue for both people on both sides, or institutions on both sides of the dialogue, to see themselves as equal. And film is a way that can happen, for the state to be able to respect another voice.
So I'm wondering, just from the very start of like an engagement, how do you come in to facilitate this? You come into a community and you're like, we're going to do a film project together. And then what happens?
Right. Well, it's important to understand that it never happens just like that. It's not me coming in on a parachute and saying, hey, look, there's this gringo who's going to do a movie with you. Of course not. I mean, if I did that, it would be a disaster.
Yes.
It's a long and gradual process. For instance, the work in the Amazon, which has been some of our most productive and I think prospectively challenging. It really helps other people think about things in different ways by working in the Amazon, because the world is just so different. And because people have thought about all of the issues that we're thinking about, but from a different way for so long. The first 4 months that Hita and I were in the Amazon, we almost did nothing. We spent lots of time just waiting.
Yeah.
Meeting people, sitting on the edge of the river, talking. It's a very, very, very slow process when you're working with people who have been traditionally marginalized, excluded, ignored, pissed on really by the state, by academics. And you can't expect that by coming in and having a couple of questions and saying, oh, we're here to hear you, that they're going to feel comfortable talking about that.
Yeah.
It's a long process of building trust. Now, one of the things that for us was essential in this process, and has been in the Amazon, in favelas and Afro-Brazilian communities, any place that we go, is that we took our daughter with us. Our first trip to the Amazon, Elena was 2 years old. And when you go into an indigenous village and you've got this 2-year-old little blonde kid who is at first kind of scared and then suddenly excited to be playing with the kids and running and jumping in the river and climbing acai palms. What that said is that we trust you sufficiently that we are bringing the most important being, the thing that what we most treasure in the world, and trusting Elena, our daughter, to them. And that's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
That's a gift. That is a way of saying you can trust us as well. There's something really powerful about that. Whether that is in a favela, a slum that has the reputation of being tremendously violent, and we're there with our daughter.
Yeah.
Or whether that is 12 days up on a canoe on a river in the Amazon, and that you come to a community. Having our daughter there really mattered. But I think also just understanding it takes time. It takes a lot of time. A story that's, I think, very powerful in this is that the first time that we went to Balayo, which is a Tucano and Desana community on the upper Rio Negro, we were invited by one of the young women who we had met in the nearest town. She said, "Oh, please come. You know, there are a bunch of kids who'd really like to learn how to make movies. My grandfather is 110 years old, and there's some people who'd like to interview him, and we'd like to have that on video." And we got there, and every morning at 5:30 in the morning in this community, everybody comes together in the Great House and they have their community meeting. Every morning, it's an amazing form of democracy. 200 people together and just decide what's important for the day. Oh, there've been some peccaries. They've been attacking somebody's crops. What are we going to do about that? Where are the fish? Anyway, it's an amazing experience to sit from 5:30 to 6:30 in the morning and see that kind of democracy and deliberation in action. And at the end of this meeting, she introduced us, Adelina introduced us and said, "So what does everybody think? Does this sound like a good idea?" And her uncle got up and said, "No, absolutely not. Do you know how many anthropologists have come in here, promised that they are going to return their thesis, and we did never see anything? Mm-hmm. How many film crews, how many TV crews have come in, and they said they were going to bring stuff back, and they didn't? Do you know how many ethnobotanists have come here and saying that they were going to help us to develop new ways of commercializing different medicine or beauty products? No, we've been screwed by all of them."
Yeah. Yeah.
And which is a really great conversation. We said, "Hey, you know, if that's the way you feel, it's fine. We're glad just to hang out here for a couple of days until the next chance to get back. We'll meet you. There's no need. It's been a privilege to come."
Yeah.
But the conversation that happened after that, and we only found out later because they were talking in Tucano, but it was really interesting of the way that this community was trying to think about how whether a dialogue would be possible here, whether or not there would be a co-learning, a co-transformation, because that's really important in Amazonian thought. Nobody just is. Everybody is becoming, and you're becoming because of your relationship with new people.
Beautiful.
And in the end, the community said, "Okay, well, let's try it. Let's do a couple of films with kids. The kids want to show a movie about how they make tops, about spinning tops. We'll do a couple on the stories that these kids are making up, and we'll see what happens." It turned out completely by coincidence that the narrator of the film about the tops was the man who was Bartolomeo's son, who was so opposed to us being there.
Okay.
And the movie won lots of prizes around the world. We took the money back from the prizes to the community. And so there's a happy ending to it. But I think that what's more important is that there is a completely legitimate and correct resistance on the part of these communities to accepting people from outside because they've been screwed so many times.
Yeah.
And so you have to be really, really slow. And that's hard for an institution that cares about efficiency, that is worried about how much money it's spending in order to make this. That's hard. That's hard.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Curtis Schmidt, producer of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. If you're a nonprofit professional who has questions about your program, or maybe you feel like you've taken your advocacy, fundraising, or membership effort as far as you can and you need some fresh ideas, then we have a special offer for you today. NPFX podcast listeners can get a free 30-minute consultation with IPM Advancement, no strings attached, when you go to ipmadvancement.com/free. Just enter a few details and an IPM team member will contact you to follow up. It's that easy. That website again is ipmadvancement.com/free. Thanks for listening, and we hope to talk to you soon. Now let's return to the episode.
Kurt, I think one of the things that I'm hearing is a lot of this is trust building. A lot of this takes time. I'm wondering, first of all, especially given maybe the ambiguity of saying we're going to co-create or collaborate on a film together with a community, what the fundraising process, the grants even look like, right? To say, oh, well, we're going to create something. We don't know what it looks like. It's going to be a thing. And then, da, da, da. So that's my first follow-up in everything that you shared. The second is for organizations, a lot of the organizations that I work with, right, they're on tight timelines, or they have specific deadlines or milestones or metrics, or legislative session is coming up and they're like, we need a narrative strategy now before somebody tries to eat our lunch, right? And so are there little things that organizations like that can do to maybe expedite on a tighter timeline or a tighter time frame?
Sure. Let me do the time frame first, because I think that's
Sure.
an important one. And for that, it's important, and something that you know very well. I've been looking at your website, Josh, that everybody tells stories. Telling stories is what makes us human. And so any group, any organization, any foundation, any grassroots NGO that's working with people has storytellers there.
Mm-hmm.
The kids that you're working with in an orphanage, the people who are using the food bank, all of these people have stories to tell. Now, one of the challenges is that they think that we want a story, and we think that they have a certain sort of story to tell. How do you get another kind of story from them? How do you get a different structure of the story that's not just, oh, we're so thankful that this food bank exists? Yes, that's true. But there's something much deeper about it. How do you get those other stories? And their fiction, I think, is an amazing tool, because fiction is almost a direct shortcut into the unconscious of those people, of the way that they tell stories. And so, for instance, the way that we work on creating fiction with an indigenous community, an Afro-Brazilian community, is really simple. You get a group of people together. Hita, who is an anthropologist, is great at this sort of stuff and is an amazing listener, will start off saying, okay, here's the story. Let's imagine that something happens. She takes the name of somebody in the circle. One of our favorite ones is a story with a group of indigenous Laclano people here in the south of Brazil. And he just says, okay, let's imagine that Ayu, who is a 11-year-old girl, she's walking through the jungle because she's going to visit her grandmother. Sort of a fairy tale frame here. And suddenly she's stung by an ant. Ayu, what happens next? Now, in this particular case, Ayu said, and Ayu turns into a zombie, which was crazy. And because I don't like zombies, it didn't work. In fact, it turned into something really important because it was a way that zombies were a way that indigenous kids were thinking about their relationship to white culture, of being transformed into somebody who they are not, that their soul is sort of taken out so that they can live in white culture. Also had to do with cell phones and how cell phones turn them into zombies. But the point is that you told a bit of the story, then João told a bit of the story, then Francisco told a bit of the story, and then Gauguin told a bit of the story. And so this got at something really important and was very fast. We were able to do that in a day of talking with them and then filming the story that they wanted. And so if you can trust the storytelling instincts and the unconscious of storytelling of the people that you're working with, and you should. I mean, why are you working with them? Because they find them interesting, because you find them powerful. That, I think, is a really important way to think about how you can expedite that process of storytelling, because you're working with somebody who you trust, who trusts you to a certain degree. They've been at your food bank, they've been at your orphanage, they've been working with you on trying to change educational policy in the state legislature. But the question is, how do you get that shortcut to their style of storytelling so that they can do that?
Yeah.
The other question, which is, how do you communicate this to a foundation? How do you communicate these ideas? It's really hard at the beginning. You have to also build trust with foundations. Having a track record is important, because we're now able to say, look, we have been able to do this. We expected to have these sort of results. We ended up having results that were this much better.
Yeah,
that's important. And being able to have that published in Frontiers in Public Health and Frontiers in Pediatrics, and know that that's been in one of these immensely prestigious academic journals, that's also important. But I think that one of the things that we've learned, and this has to do with the relationship with the state as well, but it's also true of foundation representatives, agents, that people who work within the government or people who work in foundations, they're also looking for new ideas, because they know that with a new idea, they will be able to ride that up to the next level within their institutions. If you are able to make that connection between kids from the margins who have different perspectives and who have really cool new ideas with people who are in the state trying to do good things, but knowing that in order to do those good things and to climb in the bureaucracy, they are going to have to bring something new, that's where the dialogue can happen. That confluence of interests. We had a wonderful talk yesterday with a woman who's running a lot of programs for children in the state of Amazonas, which is in the Amazon of Brazil. And she was talking about exactly that same process, that by using the films that we've made as training vehicles for the people who are going to be doing work as nurses, as doctors, as social workers in indigenous communities, and using the films and using the ideas of the kids that are in those films, that has have made much more of an impact in the people that she trains, and at the same time, which has brought her gradually higher and higher into the bureaucracy of social work in the state of the Amazon. And so I think that's a lot of the story, is that how do you find the ways that those stories can come together? We work in the Amazon, and so metaphors of flux, of flow, of how things come together, of rivers coming together and streams coming together, those are really important. They're really important to Amazonian people, but they're also really important to us.
Yeah.
And so if you think about when the Rio Negro and the Rio Solimões, which are the two big affluents of the Amazon, come together, they flow together for about 20 or 30 miles, with the brown river of the Solimões and the black river of the Negro just sort of beginning to touch each other. There are little whirlpools that come together and before they actually come and become the same thing. And that's sort of what we're doing. It's how do you find those little points of whirlpool that at the end, the river is a richer and bigger river as it goes down to the ocean.
Beautiful. I really want to explore the choice between fiction versus documentary, and how that comes about. Is that organic as directed by the community? And follow up to that, in an age of rampant disinformation, misinformation, where fiction is automatically suspect, how do you say, okay, well, this is an effective vehicle for social change, for social impact?
Unfortunately, when you talk to somebody who studied philosophy, you're going to get a strange answer to that. The French psychoanalyst and philosopher Jacques Lacan says that truth has the structure of a fiction, which is to say that we really only understand the world in narrative fictional terms. How is it that we can make this come together? Because there's just way too much that we have. And so we're creating our fictions all the time. What are we choosing to make a part of our life story? I think that actually fiction is much truer than documentary, because fiction goes directly to what people really dream, desire, and want. What is it that they see of the world? It points to their imaginary structures of how they think that the world should be, how they think that the world is. If you ask somebody just to describe the sort of place that they're living, that's interesting. If you imagine them to describe it when the dragon attacks it, there's something entirely different that happens. We did a movie called The Princess in the Alleyway, which is the story of the favelas of Recife, told as if it were a fairy tale by two little, a 9 and a 10-year-old girl. And in fact, you see so much more of this community when you see it as a fairy tale. It reveals much, much more. The question is that we have to understand that it's a fiction. And this coming year, we're going to be doing a project with nature documentaries, a group of kids who live in a jaguar preserve, the Black and indigenous children of the boat drivers and the cooks of the tourists. And one of the things that we're going to be working hard about is, as they make a nature documentary about these jaguars that they live with every day, that they're also going to be watching other nature documentaries to understand how it is that the nature documentaries that we see that are supposed to be documentary are fictions. Of course, they're fictions.
Yeah.
They're constructed on certain bases of of identification with the lion, of identification with the antelope, of why is it that we care much more about the act of predation than we care about the moment that the mother lion is caring for her kids. So the point is, how is it that not so much why do we tell fiction or nonfiction, but that we understand that the non-fictional stories that we tell are also to a certain degree fictional. Mm-hmm. But we have to be honest about that. Honest fiction is much more powerful and gets closer to the truth than honest nonfiction, and especially more than dishonest nonfiction, which is what is disinformation.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kurt. This has been awesome. I think I could geek out with you for hours. This is and you mentioned Lacan. I'm like, squee! I'm like a schoolgirl. I'm like, okay. Yeah, this has been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate it. How can people learn more about your work, maybe find ways to support you or even engage your organization?
Usina da Imaginação. We should probably put that in the...
we'll put that in the show notes.
Great. Good. But also we work and collaborate with Shine a Light, which is an American NGO. All of this emerged from 20 years of Shine a Light, which is an American foundation and easier to find. But on YouTube, on social media, it's easy to find, as well as the website.
Awesome. Thank you, Kurt.
What a fantastic conversation about his point with film being a better medium to teach than academic papers. This seems to mirror your experience with the research you did on conflict resolution, where, the experience that you had was visuals and storytelling has a lot more impact than data does. And both are important. But the fact is, when you use storytelling, it can be much more effective than statistics.
Yeah. So I think the first thing, just for clarity's sake, we do need statistics, right? We do need data. We need the evaluation to show the program's effectiveness, to demonstrate.
Right.
But human beings are emotional animals. We make decisions based on emotions. Mm-hmm. Stories tap into that. Stories help activate that emotion. But then what we do almost immediately, within microseconds, is we go back and we try to shore up the decision we've made or what we're instinctually feeling. Yep. And that's, and we're doing that with data, we're doing that with evidence, we're doing that with statistics, and we're trying to bolster our argument. And so in the space that we're in the change-making space, in the social impact space, if we have an effective model, storytelling is going to tap directly into that emotional current. And if we can do that and then back that up with truly substantial data and showcase that, then we're really winning. Yeah. Then we're making a change. And I think that's sort of what Kurt was talking about at the end when he was like, dropping Lacan and pulling in some, like philosophical thinkers and stuff like that is, it really is, we're making that decision initially based on an emotional gut reaction. And then, we're shoring up that decision with the evidence.
Yeah, it's interesting because since our original conversation about quote unquote flipping the script that we had maybe, going on a year ago or maybe even longer than that, what we've done with clients and a number of clients is we've started to front load storytelling where in their prior appeals, they were kind of burying the lead. Mm-hmm. They were burying the emotional stories. Right. And by putting it right up front, we're catching people's attention. We're immediately going into the emotional aspect and the human aspect of it. And then we get into the logic points of it. Right. And we're seeing pretty significant results with that, like differences in results. Not huge, but enough for it to be meaningful. Right. And I think like if you're going to include it in an appeal in a fundraising pitch, why would you bury it?
I feel like people are afraid or reluctant, especially given kind of the terrain that we're in now, to not lead with that fear or not lead with shame-based messaging or not lead with something that is going to get an immediate emotional response, because those are both emotions, right?
Yeah.
And so people are reluctant to lead with hope-based because they feel like the message is going to be lost.
Yeah, that's right.
Opposite is actually true, right? Like, the emotional energy, like, has a lot of breathing room when you're talking about optimism, when you're talking about hope. You're not missing that opportunity. It's just, you get like an immediate reaction for fear and for anger and for shame, but it's going to have diminishing returns, especially when you're competing against CNN and, everything else that's very fear-centric.
Absolutely. The second thing that I want to talk about is this idea that you and Kurt talk about in terms of, finding the right storytellers. So tell me a little bit more about your take on finding the right storytellers in these communities that you serve. What's the process of that? And what's, for most organizations, kind of the first step in identifying storytellers and the kind of stories that you want to tell?
Yeah. So what I thought was interesting about Kurt's approach, which is, again, very similar to ours, is, to recognize everyone has a story to tell, that everyone is a storyteller, to acknowledge that, to appreciate it, and to value it.
Yeah.
Because if we have a story to share, but we don't feel like it's going to be received or valued in a way, we're going to be reluctant to share that. And that's solid gold that we could be missing as change makers going into a community. When we were doing a lot of community activation around wellness vaccines, we were looking for community leaders, and we kept going to this grandmother who seemed to know everyone in this housing complex, and saying, "You're a community leader. Would you help organize the residents here to help go get vaccines?" And she was like, "I'm not a community leader, baby. I'm not a community leader." And, she hosted like the Wednesday night bunko. She, put on the community events. She was the first to bake cupcakes for everybody in the building. She was exactly who we wanted. And we said, okay, let's change our tactic. Do you think you could fill this bus? And it was like a little van that was going to the vaccine site. And she goes, "Oh, baby, you're going to need a bigger bus." And sure enough, she filled school buses to get folks out.
Yeah.
But she didn't identify as a community leader, even though everything she was doing was leading the community. And I think it's the same as true for storytelling. And I think that's part of what Kurt's approach is. It's part of what our approach is, you go in and you just find the people who are naturally telling those stories, gathering those crowds, sharing their experience. And that's who you want to tap into.
Yeah. It's really interesting because it strikes me that a lot of his approach is just to like find those people and start filming.
Yeah.
And you capture the content and you let the content speak for itself. And you and I have had conversations where if you're in a nonprofit role where you have a lot of power to shape perceptions, and some of that comes with a need to raise money, you have a lot of power to maybe take that content and use it in a way that would take a lot of agency away from the people you just filmed. And you have a responsibility, and we're going to talk about this at our upcoming Bridge Conference presentation. There's a responsibility to the people that you have asked to share their story.
Yeah.
And it's so important to make sure that there is an authenticity that you have a responsibility to maintain. And that is their story. That is not your story, right?
100%, 1,000%. See, that's why I'm in statistics. 1,000%. This is what Kurt was talking about, his academic background at Harvard, how he was trained. We're trained to come in. We know story. We're the experts. And, and also, to your point, Russ, there is urgency. We're trying to get legislation passed and we're trying to raise funds.
Right.
And so there's a sort of type A aspect of like, no, it has to be perfect.
Right. And it's got to serve our agenda.
It has to serve our agenda. And here's the bullet points you need to hit and make sure you open with this fact. No. And the thing is, if we can take a step back and it's not just trusting the storyteller to effectively express their story, it's also trusting the audience that story is going to be received. And if we can step back and allow that to happen, that's where the magic comes in.
Boy, that asks a lot of a client, I think. As a person who owns an agency and as someone who works with clients, have you been in situations where you've had to ask a client, hey, listen, just trust me. Like, we will get there, but you're going to have to trust me that that process, by the end of it, we will get there.
Every single day. Every day.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, I understand where that's coming from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially, to ask that of a client who's putting in a lot of money, time, energy,
Sure.
effort.
Yeah.
And really wants to make sure that we're achieving, the goals. For our purposes, when we come in, we build out what we refer to as a narrative framework.
Yes.
And it really is like a story map.
Yeah.
This is the change that we're trying to make. Here are all the audiences we're trying to reach. Here are the storytellers that resonate most with them, the channels where they're likely to tune in, and the stories that they want to hear.
Yeah.
And so the hand-holding aspect of it, Ross, is to make sure that we're going back to that narrative framework. We're going back to that story map, and we're saying, here, see, it may not sound exactly the way you would want it to sound, but we're right here on that map. We're still moving forward. We're still achieving the outcomes and goals and objectives that we set out to achieve. It just doesn't sound exactly the way it would if we scripted it just between, the four of us or your leadership team.
Right. So it's not completely seat of the pants.
No. And I will say it's not seat of the pants because of exactly that reason.
Yeah.
The story map is exactly for that purpose of like anchoring, this is the change we're trying to make. Mm-hmm. And let's keep going back to that and referring to see, okay, where are we at? Does this meet our objectives?
Yeah.
Is this working? And I want to share a quick example, Russ, is that right at the, when we were working on this health campaign at the start of the pandemic,
yeah,
we had several different touch points. It was sort of like an omni-channel campaign, and we had several different touch points of videos that we were sharing with health-centric messaging. And the videos that were created by the community health workers who were members of the community, working in the community, lived in the community, had family in the community, resonated so much more than the videos that we had crafted, the PSAs that we had polished and edited, that often had like hip hop stars or NBA players, mm-hmm. and so on. And, when we first said, well, like we should balance some of these like polished PSAs with some of our workers just picking up their iPhone and filming themselves, mm-hmm. giving some of the same messaging, they were like, well, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Right? Like, again, because of that fear aspect of like, you're going to set up like a DIY do-it-yourself kit, and we're not going to be able to manage any of the messaging. We're not even checking if the bullet points are going to be in there. We're just like putting these out. Yeah. Like that's frightening. But the messages that were created and conducted by the community health workers resonated so much farther and so much deeper than the ones from the polished ones that were the typical things that we're asked to do. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
So you might have an idea of what a community needs, but it is important to have this beginner's mind and be open to the possibility that you might not know everything. And you have to be willing to go into this process with flexibility and the ability to listen and learn.
Yeah, that's really why we created and Odd Duck created that narrative framing tool.
Yeah.
We do have certain milestones and benchmarks and things that we need to achieve along the way. But where I think where we really stick the landing, and I mean this collectively as a whole for the space, is when we have a fully formed vision of what we're trying to build. What are we really trying to achieve? if we do X, Y, and Z, why do we form this nonprofit, this community-based organization? And what does the world look like if our campaign is 100% successful?
Yeah.
And then once you have that vision and it's crystal clear, and really clients have a tough time with this.
Yeah, absolutely.
They have a very tough time with this because
Yeah.
they default to the things that feel more tangible, like the fundraising goals, right? They default to those because they feel more tangible. But if you can really kind of paint that vivid vision of what we're trying to achieve and what we're trying to accomplish, then you build the metrics, the milestones, the things that will help get us there along the way.
Excellent. Well, your conversation with Kurt was awesome. I would love to hear you guys talk more. So maybe we'll reach back out to Kurt. And if you're listening, Kurt, thank you so much for the conversation. Your organization is awesome. Your content and films are incredible. And what you're doing is fantastic. Josh and I will be at the Bridge Conference with Sade Delzan from Borealis Philanthropy and Kristen Roth from Autism Society of America to talk more about flipping the script and taking a new approach to narrative strategy and storytelling for nonprofit audience engagement. We are going to be at Bridge on Friday, August 1st. So we would love to have you join us down there at Bridge. But I do want to thank Kurt Shaw for being Josh's first guest in this series on narrative strategy. Thanks again to you, Josh, for all you bring to the podcast. Just awesome. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Thank you to our producer, Curtis Schmidt. And as always, thank you to our NPFX listeners. We'll see you next time on the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange.
That concludes this episode of the Nonprofit Fundraising Exchange. Thanks to our panel for sharing their insights and expertise. If you'd like to learn more about our panel members or any of the organizations or resources featured in this episode, we will include links in the show notes. If you like this podcast, we would love your help spreading the word. First, please subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app so you always know when a new episode is released. Second, forward the episodes you like to friends and colleagues or share them on social media. Word of mouth is one of the best ways you can help us reach more nonprofit professionals like yourself. And if you use Apple Podcasts or Audible, please leave us a review. Positive reviews are how many listeners decide whether or not to try out a new podcast. We appreciate your help. For suggestions on topics, guests, or nonprofit organizations you'd like to hear on the podcast, send an email with the subject heading NPFX suggestion to contact@ipmadvancement.com. For back episodes and more resources like white papers, infographics, and blog articles, please visit the free IPM Advancement Nonprofit Resource Library at ipmadvancement.com/resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.